Here's something I want you to sit with for a second. We call Gen Z the most anxious generation in recorded history. And in the same breath, sometimes in the same sentence, we call them entitled, lazy, and too soft to handle the real world. Now think about that. Anxious people don't feel entitled. People who are overwhelmed don't feel like they're owed something. Those two criticisms cancel each other out, which means at least one of them is wrong. And honestly, I think both of them are. Because what I've found, reading the research, reading the behavior, is that Gen Z isn't broken. They're not weak. They're not the problem. They're the most psychologically self-aware generation we've ever produced. And we have absolutely no idea what to do with that. Every generation inherits a psychological toolkit from the one before it. The tools Gen Z inherited are completely different from anything that came before. They're the first generation to grow up where words like anxiety disorder, ADHD, trauma response, and attachment styles weren't clinical jargon. They were just vocabulary. Things you learned in school, or on TikTok, or from a therapist, your parents finally agreed to pay for. And here's the thing, older generations keep getting wrong. They see that vocabulary and they assume weakness. They hear a 22-year-old say, "That situation was really triggering for me," and they roll their eyes. But what that person is actually doing is naming a physiological stress response. The racing heart, the shutdown, the flood of cortisol that every generation before them just called getting upset and pushed through. The experience was identical. The vocabulary changed. The suffering didn't go anywhere. It just got a name. Now here's where it gets complicated. There's real debate in psychology about whether labeling an experience helps you process it, or whether it creates a kind of cognitive cage, a story you tell yourself that becomes the limit of what you think you can handle. That tension is worth holding, because Gen Z is living it in real time. Okay, I have to address the phone thing, because every conversation about Gen Z ends up here eventually, and I think we've been asking the completely wrong question. The question isn't, did screens damage Gen Z's mental health? The correlation data suggests yes. More screen time, higher rates of anxiety and depression, especially in girls. That's real. But correlation is not causation. And if you stop at the correlation, you miss everything important. Here's what was happening when Gen Z hit adolescence. The 2008 financial crisis wiped out family stability for millions of them. Climate anxiety became a daily, documented reality, not an abstract future concern. School shooting drills became as routine as fire drills. And then, before they could fully process any of that, a global pandemic locked them inside during the exact developmental window when peer connection is biologically critical. They didn't turn to their phones because the phones were addictive, though they are. They turned to their phones because their phones were the only place the world still made sense. The phone was the coping mechanism, not the cause. And there's something else. Growing up with 24/7 access to global suffering, war footage in your feed, protest live streams, pandemic death tolls as scrollable content, creates a specific psychological weight that no 14-year-old in human history has ever carried before. Psychologists call this ambient awareness. Gen Z just calls it Tuesday. The snowflake critique. You've heard it. This generation can't handle anything. No grit, no resilience. And look, I get where it comes from. When you watch someone my parents' age work a job they hated for 30 years without complaint, and then see a 25-year-old quit because the culture was toxic, it reads as weakness. It's not. What we call resilience actually comes in two flavors. The old model, absorb the pain, Keep moving, don't talk about it. The newer model, the one Gen Z largely operates from, is to identify what's causing the pain, name it, set a limit around it, and restructure the environment where possible. That second model isn't weaker. In many contexts, it's smarter. There's a concept in psychology called psychological flexibility, the ability to hold discomfort without being controlled by it and still act in line with your values. Some research suggests Gen Z may actually demonstrate strong psychological flexibility. They're not avoiding hard things. They're choosing which hard things are worth it. And here's the line I want you to sit with. Calling Gen Z soft is what people say when a generation refuses to normalize the things that quietly destroyed the generation before them. That's not softness. That's pattern recognition. There's a developmental psychologist named Erik Erikson who mapped out the stages of human growth. He said adolescence, roughly 12 to 18, is where we work out identity versus role confusion. That core question of who am I and do I belong somewhere? Normally this is an internal, messy, private process. You try things, you embarrass yourself, you figure it out quietly. Gen Z is doing that exact process in public, on camera, with an algorithm deciding which version of themselves gets seen, and comment sections providing immediate feedback on whether they're acceptable. The micro-labels, the fluid identities, the constant self-examination, this isn't narcissism. It's identity formation under conditions that are genuinely unprecedented. And here's the thing that breaks my heart a little. The generation most criticized for being obsessed with identity is also the loneliest generation we've ever measured. The search for identity is also a search for belonging, and a lot of them haven't found it yet. So what do we actually do with all of this? Because I don't want this video to just be a defense. I want it to be useful. First, they need environments where emotional honesty isn't treated as a liability. In workplaces, in families, in schools, the fastest way to push a Gen Z person into silence or exit is to make them feel like naming their experience is a problem. It isn't. It's data. Second, they need real agency, not the performance of being consulted, actual influence over decisions that affect their lives. They can read the difference between being invited into a conversation and being managed through one, and they will disengage from the latter every single time. Third, and this one is harder, the conversation has to go both ways. Gen Z is regularly asked to adapt, to toughen up, to meet older structures where they are. But those structures were built on a set of assumptions about work, about identity, about what suffering is acceptable, that are worth examining, not abandoning, examining. The most honest question isn't what's wrong with Gen Z. The most honest question is, what kind of world did we hand them, and are we willing to look at what that cost them? Whether you're Gen Z watching this and feeling finally seen, or you're watching from the outside and something in here made you pause, I want to ask you one thing. What assumption did you carry in that you're leaving with differently? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, send it to them. Not to win an argument, just to open a door. I'll see you in the next one.